Right, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. But while we're waiting, if you want to put in the chat where you're coming from, we'd love to see that. We've got Liz up in Ashland. Welcome, Liz. Yeah, please, if you're logging in, share where you're coming from this morning. Say hello. I am in New Berlin, Wisconsin today.
I'm in Fitchburg, Wisconsin.
Nice. We've got Sparta, Sue from Cable, hello, and hello in Sun Prairie. Sharon in Milwaukee, Tanika in Madison. Great, so we are going to get started in about a minute here, but we're just saying hello as everybody gets in. Got Phillips, Crandon, Green Lake, Washburn, Johnson Creek, North Prairie. It's great to see people from all around the state today. Marinette. Wonderful. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kristen Leffelman, the Southeast Outreach Coordinator for the Wisconsin Historical Society. And we're very excited to be offering this opportunity this morning to learn about local government records and local historical societies. So just a few notes before we begin here, and let me switch slides here. All right. So once our presentation begins, we are going to be turning off the chat so that the speaker has our full attention. During that time, please use Zoom's Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to direct questions to the speaker. During the Q&A period, general comments can be sent with the chat function. And today we'll be holding all questions until the end of the presentation. So we'll get to as many questions as possible while respecting our presenters' time. So we may combine questions if necessary. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Baraniak, the Wisconsin Historical Society's Local Government Records Archivist, for today's presentation. Thank you, Andrew.
Oh, now you get to watch me stumble around as I get things set up. All right. Well, I'm glad everybody could attend today. As I get my screen set up here, get the presentation going. So as Kristen said, my name is Andrew Baraniak. I'm the Local Government Records Archivist at the Wisconsin Historical Society. A little bit about me. I'm originally not from Wisconsin, I'm from Pennsylvania, and I kind of came up through working first and volunteering at the local historical society in my county, Pennsylvania. So I kind of went up, started there, got interested in museum work, started working at a larger museum where I'm originally from too. They had a couple different sites, and then sort of went completely full bore into the archive profession, worked at a couple of universities in Pennsylvania before I ended up out here, first working at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum here in Madison. And now I've been the local government records archivist for about 7 or 8 years now. And for those of you who are not aware what my role is, what I do for the society, I work with all forms of local government across the state to identify records that have historical or informational value, and then I tack those records for preservation with the Wisconsin Historical Society and the state archives. And we're going to get more into detail on that as this slide goes through, or as we go through the presentation here today. Yeah, and if you have questions, by all means, ask. Again, we're kind of looking to the end. I'm trying to give plenty of time at the end to answer questions, to go over things maybe that I need to be clarified or something like that. And I do have some time. So if we do go a little over, that's fine too. All right, with that, let's move on. So for today, what we're going to talk about are a specific type of records. And generally, there are two different types of records that are held in an archives. Well, they're either records, which are usually something that is kept by an institution, usually created as part of an institutional memory. Those can be anything from government to corporations to any kind of institution that might create something. Those are generally considered records. This is different than what we consider manuscripts, which are usually created by an individual. So somebody that is either private or something of that nature. So think about correspondence between family members or something like that. Those would be basically what we consider manuscripts. Those records generally, there's like a niche of what they're looking to collect, and what archives are looking to collect out of that. And those are all defined by their collecting goals. For this particular talk, what we are going to focus on specifically are records. We're not going to talk about manuscripts because that's where I'm at. I'm into records collecting. In specific, we're going to talk about government records and specifically what we sometimes refer to as public records. And we're going to go into more detail on that as we go along. But first, I'm going to do a little quick history lesson here for you. And kind of my tongue-in-cheek image here about the history of public records in Wisconsin with the burning building, kind of get my sense of humor. But this all kind of goes into how the state archives was set up in Wisconsin and how the laws that we're going to go over as we go through these slides all apply and how they came into effect. So as a state, Wisconsin in the early years, so this is the 19th century, didn't have any public record laws or any laws that were dealing with governance of records created by governmental units. There was no way to get rid of obsolete records. There weren't really any laws saying that what needed to be preserved. There were steps that were starting to take around the 1880s where people were starting to look and say, oh, hey, wait, there's a lot of really good records that we have at the state that have high historical value. We should be looking to preserve them. But there wasn't any kind of movement for laws. And it really didn't take effect until after the Capitol fire in 1904, which is what this slide, the image in this slide is interpreting. The fire basically destroyed the Capitol building at the time, but luckily most of the records were preserved because steps were taken just internally to make sure historical records were safe. This got people thinking though, hey, what happens if other buildings burn down? Or what if there's a giant city fire where Madison burns to the ground or something like that? What happens to those records? What they found by doing an analysis was that there would be significant loss of the informational records created by the state of Wisconsin. So they began looking around. They said, okay, we need to start a state archives. But rather than create a whole new department in the state, they turned to the Wisconsin Historical Society because at the time, the Wisconsin Historical Society, just down the street from the state capitol, had just built a brand new state-of-the-art building for storing and preserving manuscripts and records. So that's how the Historical Society becomes involved in public records, in becoming the state archives. But it also takes a number of years before laws really get put into place. While there are laws that say, okay, you can transfer stuff to the Historical Society, there was a lot of squishiness about how that was to happen. And it wasn't until after World War II in the late 1940s when there was really a glut of records being produced because of the Depression and because of World War II that laws were really passed basically saying, okay, here's how long you need to keep records. Here's what you need to do if you want to destroy records, and here's what you do in order to transfer those records to the state archives for preservation. And it also turned away from state archives at that point, or state records at that point, and started looking at the local levels. They started looking at it and saying, well, we should also be preserving county records. We should also be preserving city records, municipality records. So there are in court records. So then there are laws passed that basically say, okay, here's what local units need to do as far as scheduling their records, how long they need to retain them, and then how they need to transfer them to the state archives for preservation once that retention period passes. So what is a public record? So basically, a public record is defined, it's defined in state statutes, but it's basically any sort of document that is created as part of a government unit that documents how they're performing their tasks or assigned duties. So that the quote that I have on this slide comes straight from a statute, so specifically 1661(2)(b). So basically what it's saying is that anything that you do if you work for a government that you create as part of your daily duties or something that is assigned by statutes for governments to create is considered to be a public record. Public records are basically covered any government unit that is listed on this slide. So that's state agencies, counties, cities, villages, towns, circuit and county courts, school districts, sewerage districts, lake districts, and any other quasi form of government. That all is encompassed under government units that are identified as having public records. The other thing that comes out of public records laws, or what is defined as a public record, is that they're open to the public. And they're open, and that is considered under statutes 1931 to 1939. What does that mean? Well, that means that the public, anybody in the public, has the ability to ask, to review and see records created by government units in the state. These are often called sunshine laws. You might hear that referred to as well. Basically, that means that the light shines on the record, so the public has the right to see what the government units are doing. Anything dealing with open records laws, anything dealing with access to the public, it all applies to government records as long as they exist. So as long as the record is out there, it is considered a public record if it was created by a government unit, and the public has the right to ask to see that record at any time. Excuse me there. So what are some of the laws that actually do govern public records in Wisconsin? There's a lot out there, and they're scattered throughout the statutes, and you really need to know where to look to find them. But there are a couple of key ones that you do need to kind of cover, sets up a lot of what we're going to talk about, and also how that they can be retained and destroyed. So the first one we're going to talk about is 1661. So that section of the statute basically outlines what a public record is, so how you can identify a public record. It also establishes the Public Records Board. And for those of you who are not aware what the Public Records Board does, the Public Records Board has the ability to set and establish minimum retention times on records that are created by governmental units. And that they have the ability to do that both for state agencies and local units of government. Another statute, and a big one that I refer to quite frequently, is 1921. So that section basically outlines exactly who has ownership of the records that are created by the government. And basically what it says is that the person who created the record doesn't have title. It's the governmental unit that retains the title. So when you leave your position, if you're a public employee, you can't take the records with you. They stay with the government that created them. And then basically also says that it's whoever comes into that position. So like if you're a clerk of a town and you assume the title of clerk of a town from the former clerk, the records that clerk created become your responsibility. So it passes that lineage down, basically saying that it's the government unit that has title or ownership of the records that they create. It also sets up the basic retention period. So retention periods are the amount of time that records should be maintained by a local unit of government or a state agency. The minimum time that's set up generally is 7 years. You'll see that's written throughout 1921 quite frequently. So that's the minimum time is 7 years, unless another statute sets the retention period, or the Public Record Board sets a minimum retention time. So those are basically how you can set retention periods. It also sets up and establishes the procedures for how to destroy records once they go beyond that retention period. The process there is once they are beyond their required retention period, so say it's 7 years, the local unit of government has the option to destroy them, but before they destroy them, they must offer it to the Wisconsin Historical Society for review and transfer for long-term preservation. And that's further set up too in 1923 and in 4409, which outlines exactly that all forms of local government, so that's counties, cities, villages, towns, courts, district attorneys, school districts, everything that if you're a government, you have to offer it to the Wisconsin Historical Society before you can destroy it. And then at that point, there's 60 days that we have to review it before it can be destroyed. And if we decide that it should be transferred, it's transferred into our storage. So the process, again, I kind of outlined that they have to give 60-day notification. That is required. It's written notification. We keep a record of all the notifications that are given to us. Records that are transferred to the Wisconsin Historical Society have title transfer go along with them. So that means that the Wisconsin Historical Society has the ability to assume control over the records that government units create. And it's in the statutes that way. What that means is once we take control of them, we are responsible for providing the access to those records. So what do? We look at them, we arrange them, we do preservation work if needed, and then we also catalog the records into our catalog system, which is run by the UW library system. So that's a searchable catalog where you can look the records up. You can say, okay, I'm looking for tax rolls. Let's see if Dane County tax rolls are with the Wisconsin Historical Society, and you can look it up, and then you can see if we hold them or not. You're not going to see the actual record, but you will see what we actually physically have and hold. We also have the ability to apply restrictions on the records, and we're going to discuss this further as we go through the slides, that certain records, even though they are open to the public, have restrictions placed on them by statute or by federal law. So we monitor that and we apply those restrictions. And then we also provide the public access that's required under public records laws. We have a reading room in our facility that has access through regular business hours. And we have a reference staff that is more than willing to help work with the patrons and decide, like, okay, these are the records you're looking for. Let's see if we can find them to help you out. So one of the things that we do, and you're going to hear me talk as we get more into the slides too, is talking about appraisal. And appraisal is basically a process in the archival world of reviewing records and materials and determining whether or not it has historical or informational value. How do we do this? This is not a process like I might do appraisal records, site appraisals. I was actually just out in Richland County at the courthouse looking at records that they have in their storage units and determining if it has historical value. While I do those site information, I'm basing that on guidance that we have worked out over a long period of time, even before I was there or in this position. And that's working with governmental units to create record schedules to determine what they have, what that information is in those records, and then saying, okay, is that information, does it have historical value? We're also looking at saying, okay, is the information that is in those records duplicated in other sources? So are there other records out there? Because when you're starting to deal with government records, the one thing that governments do very efficiently is create lots of duplication. So it's looking at saying, okay, do you have those records and that information somewhere else? case in point with assessment rules, sometimes assessment rules duplicate what counties have in their county tax records. So it's comparing to say, okay, do the municipal assessment rules duplicate what the counties have, and is that information available elsewhere, or is it different? So it's taking that time to determine what is there, what records are recorded, and is that information somewhere else. When we also work with our reference team, so I am always asking our reference archivists, well, what are people looking for? You know, are there certain groups of records that maybe we should be looking to collect? Maybe I need to make a focus on reaching out to local units to make sure we're transferring these sort of records because that's what people are asking for. And determining whether or not that information is recorded elsewhere and should we collect it. So these are all processes that go into the evaluation of what the society collects and what we preserve. Some of the records that we do collect, I mean, just for examples, I mean, anything dealing with administration of government, settlement of estates, resolution of family matters, vital statistics, civil and criminal adjudications, records documenting naturalizations, education records, private property ownership records, taxation records. Those are all groups that we've identified as having high historical and informational value and things that we should be transferring for long-term preservation. And again, it's not just me. There's a lot of archivists that work and work with the public to determine how we collect those records. The other thing we do is that once records are transferred, they're not necessarily living in Madison, although that's where the bulk of our storage is in the city of Madison. But we do work with partnerships to the UW campus libraries and the Great Lakes Visitor Center up in Ashland to set up regional repositories that hold and provide access to records created in that region. Excuse me. So we have across the state, it's divided into 14 geographic locations, one of them being our building here in Madison, but then across there's 12 UW campus libraries that hold them. And then the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center. The records that are created within those boundaries may come to Madison first, just to do preservation work on it or cataloging, something of that nature. But then ultimately they're intended to be stored at one of these area research centers. The area research centers operate on routine hours, so it's usually Monday through Friday. They may have some weekends, but I'm not 100% sure. But they have set hours, they have secure storage facilities, they have preservation roadblocks in place to keep the records safe. And they also then, again, provide the access for us. But they're not owned by the UW campuses. They're still our records. They're still controlled by the state archives. We're just working with them to provide access. The other cool thing about what this area research center network has is that the records can transfer back and forth. So say you're looking for records from Dane County, but you're up in Superior, we can get those records up there as long as it's safe to transfer them across the state. You know, depending on the preservation and the fragility of them, they might not transfer, but we do our best to make sure that we can get records across for people to access. So let's get into the heart of the topic here. So what we're looking at, one of the reasons that we wanted to bring this presentation up is talking about records that might be in your holdings, or potentially look at it that say, well, maybe you want to collect records. And there are a lot of pitfalls when dealing with holding public records outside of the government institution that created them or the Wisconsin Historical Society. And I'm going to start going over where those pitfalls are and what you can do and what we recommend. So first, the thing to remember is when you're dealing with public records, all public records laws apply to the record as long as it exists. And that's regardless of if it's beyond its retention period, because retention periods are just suggested times that a unit of government can get rid of a record. Doesn't mean they have to, it just means they can, but they're still considered a public record. So all public records laws still apply if it's beyond its retention period. It also applies to any record that has been offered to the Wisconsin Historical Society, and the Wisconsin Historical Society has declined or waived the notification on those records. So if the record has been declined for transfer, it's still a public record. You still have to follow public record laws with it, even though we've declined it and it's been offered. The only time public record laws do not apply to a public record is when it's destroyed. That's the only time. If you have public records in your holdings, you need to understand again that is what is applying there, that they are public records and you need to provide timely public access to them. We're going to go over a couple things, and I'm going to break down the bottom half of this slide into a couple of different slides. We're going to talk more about it, but you need to understand who really has title to those records, who owns them. You need to understand that you have to have full accessibility to the records. You need to also understand and identify and administer any restrictions that might apply to those records, because again, just because it's public doesn't mean it doesn't have a confidential status. And you also should be publicizing your holdings because, and we're going to get into why, but again, it's just making sure that you're understanding, hey, we have these records. If this is what you're looking for, here's where you need to go to find them. So first, we're going to talk about ownership, which is what we refer to as title of the public records. And as I specified, as we're talking about the laws, under statute, the way that it's defined in the statute, there are only two defined owners of public records in the state of Wisconsin. That's the unit of government that created them and the State Historical Society or the Wisconsin Historical Society. Those are the only two entities named as having the ability to own title to public records. This is also further defined from statements from the Attorney General's office that basically say that those are the only two units, or the only two entities that can hold title to public records. So if you have local government records in your holding, doesn't matter how old they are, doesn't matter when they were made, if they were made in 1840, they're still considered a public record. Technically, you don't own them. The ownership resides with the government unit that created them. So if you have them, even if you have a signed deed of gift, that doesn't transfer title. It doesn't transfer ownership. That ownership still resides with the local unit that created them. This can get a little tricky because, sometimes local units go away, through annexation, especially when you're dealing with town records. Or potentially maybe that department, if you're dealing with counties, that department no longer exists. So what happens in those situations when a unit of government is absorbed into another unit of government, that title goes along with it. So say a town is annexed by a city. When it's annexed, when all those records, technically the title goes to the city. So they would be the owner of the records. Those are things to keep in mind as when you're dealing with records. Key point, they're not your records. So you can't just get rid of them. So if you ever decide, hey, we don't want these records anymore, you can't just throw them out because you don't own them. You would have to give them back to the government unit that created them. You also don't have the ability to sell or auction off those records. Those records are, since they're not yours, they're property of the government unit, so they cannot go into private ownership. Again, because it's not defined by the statutes. The second point of things that you need to understand is that there are public access requirements on all public records. So if you have them, you must provide the public access. Where this can get a little tricky is if you're a local historical society and you shut down for 6 months or 3 months or something like that. Technically, by closing, you would have to still be able to provide access to those records if somebody ever came in and asked for them. This could get a little tricky if you're dealing with assessment roles. I do know that one of the requested records that we have are tax rolls assessment rolls. So if you have assessment rolls for a particular unit of government that you're housing, somebody were to come into that unit of government and ask for them, they would be turned to you and you would have to figure out a way to provide the access to those records. Same would follow with court records. Court records are one of the higher requested record. If you would happen to have court records in your holdings, again, you're going to have to make sure that you can provide access to them. I am not a lawyer, I'm not a legal counsel, but there is potential for you being held liable if you cannot provide that timely access to those records. Again, I'm not a lawyer, can't say that you will, but you may. So again, it's one of those things where you need to make sure you have a plan in place for how you can provide access to them. And as part of that responsibility, and we're going to get that into the next slide as well too, going along with public access, you need to identify if there are records that have confidential status. And if they have confidential status, then you need to make sure that you're applying whatever restrictions are responsible for you to put on those records during a public records request. So that is going to also fall on you. Since you might, even though you don't own the records, you have the records, you're providing the access to the records, so you need to know if there is an issue there that would restrict you from access, or that would restrict the public from accessing the records because of a law or something like that. That falls on you. All right, so we're going to talk about the restrictions and how you can identify them and what restrictions are out there, and there's a lot to kind of unpack in this slide. So we'll get into it here. There are various levels and avenues that do restrict records. And the two main ones are coming from federal law and coming from state law. The first couple ones that I have in there they're listed on this slide, deal with federal laws that restrict access to records. The first one is student records, which some of you may have in your holdings. There is a restriction that is out there that's restricted, which is called FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It was instituted in 1974. Basically what it restricts are the student records. It's not restricting the administrative records of the school, it's restricting the individual student record. The one thing that, and this is where it gets tricky, and you got to know the law, that it restricts records from 1974 forward. There's an interpretation here in the state that says, okay, that doesn't apply to records the way that they're interpreting the law to records before 1974. But it does get a little squishy. And when you talk to legal counsel on it, they're always kind of like, yeah, you might be in violation if somebody were to press. So again, one of those things that you do need to be aware of is there is a restriction that's out there, federal restriction on student records. Another one, healthcare records. And that's restricted under HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And I'm glad I have all this written down here because I can never remember exactly what that stands for. Healthcare records, again, are kind of like the student records. It's the individual healthcare records. But it does get a little broad, and it also gets pretty squishy about how it applies. So what it applies to is anything dealing with somebody's healthcare information. It's the individual's healthcare. That can be anything from routine checkups, but also gets into mental health. So when you're dealing with mental health, sometimes HIPAA gets involved in that because you're dealing with somebody's health information. It does get kind of squishy about who has the rights to restrict and how it applies, and whether or not it applies to institutions that are holding archival materials. Again, when you talk to legal counsel on this, a lot of them kind of go, it's a little gray area. But again, those are two major restrictions at the federal level that restrict access to information. Another one that you'll hear people talk about is personally identifiable information, or PII. That's basically any information that can specifically identify an individual through different markers. What are those markers? Well, that could be anything from name, address, social security number, credit card information, driver's license number, anything that would be where you have multiple identifiers that can specifically identify an individual are restrictable under personally identifiable information rules. How do you determine that? Well, a lot of that is actually just going through the records and looking at them, you know, and identifying whether or not they have personally identifiable information in there. Again, gets squishy when you're talking about older records. But as we're gonna talk, and I'm gonna say that there's no real definition of how far back these laws go. So again, it becomes really kind of a gray area when you're administering access to these records, and you need to be aware if you have any of this information in there before you provide access. The other ones that I have listed on here all come out of Wisconsin statutes. There's restrictions on guardian competence, protective placements, mental health, adoption, public assistance or welfare records, minor records, juvenile records, all have specific restrictions that are put on them through Wisconsin statutes. There are all through the Wisconsin statutes, they do provide avenues for access, but usually those avenues for access are either applying to the individual whom that record applies to, or you have to get clearance from some sort of legal authority, usually a judge in that county or whoever that would cover those records that are being created. The thing is, and it's dealing with confidential records that becomes really problematic, especially with local records, that as long as it has confidential character, if it's been assigned a record and they know it has confidential character, it stays with the record. Case in point, adoption records. I highly doubt you have adoption records in there because most that usually goes to the courts, and courts are pretty locked down about keeping those records. But adoption records basically seal, by the way that the statute is written, basically seal as soon as the parties involved are deceased, because there's no way for anybody else to gain access to them, according to the law. So even though it might be a 150-year-old adoption record, technically it's still sealed. So those are things that you need to be aware of about like where those avenues are and if there's anything that lifts. And unfortunately, the way that the laws are written in Wisconsin, most local records do not lift, meaning that confidential status applies to them as long as they exist. And again, I'm going to stress, it falls on the caretaker to make sure that they're applying those laws, make sure that you're applying those correctly, and you know what the laws are. These are all things that in the society we've monitored, we've worked with local units, we've worked with legal counsel in order to determine this, and then we red flag these as soon as we know we have them in our collection. So then our reference team knows how to administer access, and we have guidance on how they need to administer access. And that's something that you would need to be aware of as well. And finally, one thing that we do ask, and I agree this is a really key point, would be that you publicize your holding. If you're making it available and known that you have those records in your holding. Why is that important? Well, since the way that the statutes are written about how you can destroy and dispose of obsolete records, it's not always known if local historical societies have those records. from our perspective, if we don't have them and the local unit says they didn't have them, and we have a following procedure documentation that says that they were properly destroyed by the local unit of government, we're assuming they're destroyed, that they don't exist. But knowing that if you have those records, or knowing where those records are, allows us to point people to say, okay, here's where you need to go to get that information. Because if we don't know and we're assuming they're destroyed, we might be telling the individual, oh, those records don't exist, but in reality, they're in your holdings. So it's always good to make sure that you're publicizing or you're working with us or the local unit of government to identify if you have those records, and then also bringing those people in to review those records and to get the information that they're trying to seek. So again, reaching out to us or letting the local units know is really key in order for us to provide access and provide that public access to those records. So with the records you have, again, there's a lot of information that I'm giving here, and this is a relatively short talk to kind of go over this topic. But if you're looking at it and you have records in your holdings, consider if you want to be in the records game. There's a lot of moving parts to handling public records. There's a lot of things you need to be aware of, that you need to follow, from whether or not you own them to whether or not you have restricted information in those records and providing the public access. And if you're saying, you know what, this isn't for us, it's not something we want to get involved with, contact me. I do have my contact information in a later slide that you can share. And I believe we're going to share the slides too, so you can get my contact information. But reach out to me, call me, and say, hey, we got this. Would this be something you're interested in? Or we're no longer interested in these records. Would you come take a look at them? I'd be more than happy to do that. I actually, after 2 years of being locked down and not being able to travel, I am so thankful that I'm finally being able to get out on the road again and visit people, because that's the best part of my job, is actually going out and working with local units to see what records are out there and determine what needs to be preserved. So again, get in touch with me. If you decide you want to hold those records, there's no SWAT team that's going to come beat down your door to take those records out from us. But make sure that you have an understanding of who has clear ownership and how those records got there. So it would be identifying what you have, identifying, working with the local unit of government that created them to have an understanding that they're still the owner of those records. You're just providing the access, and have a signed agreement that clearly states that. What that does is basically kind of alleviate you a little bit. And once you're not there, it also provides guidance of whomever comes in as your successor for how they should be handling those records moving forward. One question that I do get a lot of, and I'm sure some of you were thinking, we're like, well, why can't we just collect the records that you decline? Just for reference points, I mean, we only take about 3 to 5% of the records that are ever offered to us for transfer. That's because we're getting offers of things like receipts or bank statements, things that where we're not looking to capture those routine daily transactions. We're looking to capture the things that have long-term historical or informational value. So that's really kind of boils down to about 3 to 5% of the records that are out there. Again, as I pointed out, the records that we have declined have gone through a pretty lengthy appraisal process. We're not just saying, we don't want those. We're actually putting a lot of effort and time and documenting why we've selected certain records for preservation. So the records that we decline generally have that lower informational value. Case in point, I've seen ledger books that are out there that local units may have. They'll just say ledger on the side of it. When you open it up, the only thing that's in there is just a row of numbers. No context, no description, no information as to what that means. Those are records we're not going to transfer because you can't use them. There's nothing there that gives you any kind of information about what was being recorded or how that was affecting the government record. So those are good examples of types of records we don't collect. And that's going to be a lot of the records that are out there. So once they offer them, if we decline them, it's going to be records that there's just not a lot of informational value in there. The other thing also is that they tend to duplicate information. So we might be declining it because we've looked at it and said, okay, well, we already have that here. So the information is found elsewhere. And we're usually not looking to document that. So the records that you might be collecting are already documenting in other sources. So it's, again, not really saving anything. The other thing that it can do is cause confusion. I've had local units, usually because there's administrative change, somebody retires and then somebody new comes in, and then a local historical society will contact them and say, hey, we got these records, do you want them back? And they're like, well, we destroyed those, or they thought they were destroyed, right? So it just cuts down on the confusion by not taking those records in, because by law, they should have been destroyed. So if you do decide you want out, things to remember, they're not your records. You just can't get rid of them. You have to offer them back to the creating unit of government. I bet in most cases that the creating unit of government is probably going to look at you and say, we don't want them. In that instance, contact me. Because again, if they're saying they don't want them and you don't know if they've ever been offered to the historical society, which is a possibility, then talk to me. And that can just be, you don't need to go through like the formal destruct process. That's simply just giving me a call or sending me an email, and then talking to me about what you have and what you're looking to divest out of your holdings. If it comes down to it, you know, that the government unit doesn't want them and we are not interested in them, they should be destroyed. Again, you can't sell them because there's no title there. You don't have title to do that. They need to be destroyed. If you don't have the ability to do that, that's something, again, you could talk to me about. We don't have a destruction process that we destroy records at our facility, but the State Records Center, which is in Madison, works with state agency, does have the ability to destroy records if you want a confidential destruct. And again, make sure, I can't stress it enough, that they're not your records. You can't just sell them. You can't give them to the public. They must be destroyed. All things to consider when you're getting rid of your records. And if you have any questions at all, you should always reach out to me. Always happy to chat and always happy to help guide you through this process. So finally, here's my contact information. Again, I'm planning on sharing these slides, so don't feel like you have to quick scramble to write all this information down. Email is probably the best way to get in touch with me, just because I'm not always at my desk. So you can leave a message, and especially now I'm starting to transition into travel mode. One, because the weather is starting to get a little nicer, although today it's a little gloomy outside here in Fitchburg anyways. But I am starting to travel, so I'm not always at my desk. So it might take me a while to get back to you by phone, but by all means, you can call and leave me a message. If you have any questions about what we do or the process that we use for care for records, for cataloging the records, for working with local governments, advice we give about records, please go to our website. That's a long link there. I know, unfortunately, I can't really shorten that. But what that link there goes to is our local records program. So there's helpful information about what we hold, what we collect, how we care for records, that sort of thing. And so you can kind of see the process of what and how we work with local units of government. There isn't really anything on this particular topic on our website. But again, just for reference purposes to see what we do, by all means, go ahead and visit. And look at that. I didn't even time this, but I was shooting for about 45 minutes and I hit that pretty close. So I will begin taking questions. And once I familiarize myself with the chat.
Oh, we've got it covered for you, Andrew. Don't worry.
Oh, perfect.
And I'm going to start pretty easy with kind of a yes or no question, I think. Are public libraries considered units of local government?
Yes.
All right. Perfect.
So usually you fall under the municipality that would be potentially funding you. If you're wondering about scheduling records, there is a general record schedule for public libraries that is available on the Public Records Board website. That general schedule covers basic records that all public libraries create. I can't give you an example because I don't have the schedules memorized, but it is available. It is available for use, and I do see, I do get information about all the public libraries that adopt that schedule for use. So if you have any questions about that, by all means, shoot me a message after this, and I'd be happy to share that information with you.
Great. So we have a couple of questions kind of about that public access piece.
Yep.
One person asked, is 1 hour a week to view a public record enough? Like, does that satisfy open to the public? And we have somebody else who asked, what about records that are held at the museum, which is city owned? Can the public have the right to see them if the museum is closed 6 months out of the year? Can the director refuse to let the public come and do research with those records?
Okay, so I'll start unpacking that. And I might need to go backwards because I forget what the first question was. Exactly.
That was kind of is 1 hour a week enough?
Oh, yes, that's right. Is 1 hour a week. So there is no definition as to the frequency or how fast you need to provide access under open records laws. It just needs to be timely. So if you have open hours where somebody can't come in, you're probably fine. The problem gets into when you're dealing with very limited time, which would be something more like you're closed 6 months out of the year. That becomes a problem because I would hedge my bets that most legal counsel is going to say that's not frequent enough to meet the public records requests in that timely manner. As far as access goes, there is no way to refuse access to a public record in a request. The only way you can do it is that you could say, well, it's confidential. If there's a confidential statute governing those records, then you could say, well, that's confidential and it's confidential under the statute. But you don't have the ability to say, well, we're closed, you can't come in and see them. That would be in violation of public records laws. So that's, again, you need to make sure if you are closed, like if you're closed to the public, you don't have open hours. If somebody does come in and say, hey, I want to research these records, you have to figure out a way to get those records to them. And you have to do it in a timely manner, and telling them to wait 6 months probably isn't going to cut it. Again, I'm not a lawyer.
So having been a former school archivist myself, I'm not surprised to see that we have a lot of questions about school records.
Yep.
And particularly the confidentiality of those.
Yep.
So, here's someone who's asking about school census records from one-room country schools that have a list of students. Mm-hmm. Does that fall within confidentiality statutes? And can that information be made available to researchers?
The short answer to that is yes, probably. The way FERPA is interpreted, and again, I don't even think it's a formal opinion from the Attorney General's office. I think it's a memo that came out in probably about 30 years ago, that basically said that the way that the law is written, they did not interpret it to be retroactive, meaning that when FERPA went into law in 1974, it only applies to all records created after 1974, when it went into law. It does get a little squishy though. And the further back you go, you're probably fine. Like I can't envision anybody coming in and looking at an old one-room schoolhouse record and then being in trouble for doing that, because the further you get away, it's all based on the confidentiality for the individual, and you have a better chance of that individual being deceased the older the record gets. But there isn't really any precedence for this either. So that's where it gets a little squishy. Are you probably fine? Yes. I would say you're fine. But just be aware if you have, especially if you get into like more modern records, like if you have records that would be getting to around consolidation time, so 1960s, you might want to think about whether or not you want to be providing access to those, because you're getting closer to that cutoff point, and I have a feeling that that could become problematic, especially if the individual is still alive.
And that would apply to like report cards as well.
As far as my understanding is, yes, as long as it's documenting the record of the student. So like that's where those records will become like fall under FERPA. FERPA doesn't apply to, and I know these records exist for like the one-room schoolhouses. You'll find like ledgers that talk about supplies that are buying, or the volumes that were being used for educating the students, that sort of thing. That's not under FERPA. It only applies to the individual. Once you can identify the individual in their individual students' records, so their grades, their attendance, that sort of thing, then that falls under FERPA.
Got it. All right, so changing tracks just a little bit. Are there funds available from any source to help a local historical society identify and publicize its archival holdings of public records?
That's a really good question. I am not aware of that, but what I would need to do is look to see if there's anything through a couple sources that are out there, which is the 𝗬𝗵, State Historical, can't remember what it stands for, but there's an organization that's basically made up of like historical units that they do offer some of that funding. Now, I don't know if they have anything specifically for local units to use that potentially would be like a grant, but I don't know off the top of my head. That would be something I would have to look at and see. That would be like, if you have any questions about that, just contact me offline here. I'd be happy to look into it, or even ask like my supervisor just to know, because I know Abby serves on the 𝗬𝗵, I think. So she might have a better knowledge of what might be out there for local units to use or access.
Great. State Historic Records Advisory Board.
Thank you.
Yeah. Perfect. So
I'm always bad. I'm like, I had to make sure that I had FERPA written out, because I'm like, there's no way I'm going to remember what this stands for.
So you talked a bit about sealed records, and someone asks, once parties involved in records are dead and are sealed forever, are they often destroyed? If not, why not?
They are not. So again, I brought up adoption. Adoption is really the only case where I know this happens, where the avenues for access that are put out in the statutes basically seal it, because when the parties die, those are the only people that have access to paths in adoption. Adoption records up until 8 months ago, were held under permanent retention by the courthouses. So they're governed under, so the courts system here in Wisconsin has their own retention system, and adoption records are part of that and are filed under them. So those records were sealed and permanent. Now, the court just changed their retention period to 150 years, meaning that they have, after 150 years, the ability to destroy adoption records. I was on that advisory panel when they were debating this change, and I, like this kid in there, I was like, I got a lot of problems with this because my thought was, well, from their perspective, they were looking, there's no reason, they can't provide access, so let's destroy them. And I was saying, well, wait a minute, you're dealing with records that are extremely old. And it might be the only record out there. Even if it's sealed, it still might be the only record out there. So in the case of that, when they shortened that retention, or they changed the retention period, I said, absolutely, we want those. Now, I completely understand that they're sealed. Like if you were to come in and ask to see them, we can't provide access because at 150 years, you know that person is dead. So we can't provide access, but I was also not willing to let those records go, knowing full well that that's probably the only record that's out there in the case when you're dealing that old. Vital records, so there's the Office of Vital Records, also had a big problem with that too, because they were not sure if they had the record. And there's no way to do it. You'd have to look at all 72 counties and compare to see if they have the record and compare it to their holdings. And in both cases, both me from the Historical Society and Vital Records said, you shouldn't be destroying those. And Vital Records was fine when I said, we're going to transfer those. They need to offer them to us. Part of that is maybe also in the future, probably not in my lifetime, but maybe down the road, somebody will look at that and say, you know what, it doesn't make sense to have these records sealed for forever. Maybe they'll open it at maybe 150 years or something like that. But that would involve legislative change, because the way that it's written now is they're just sealed. The other records that I mentioned have easier avenues or ways to get access, but I say easier, it's still pretty difficult. I mean, there's nothing written into the statutes that say once a record hits 100 years old, it's open. That doesn't exist. So basically the way that the statutes are written, it just says, we know that this record is restricted because it has this information in it, and here's how you can gain access. That's it. Doesn't lift it after a certain period of time. And the reason we don't destroy some of those records is because it might be the only information out there. And that's kind of, we're looking at it from that perspective and saying, you know what, we understand it's restricted, but that's it. If it's gone, it is gone. And we don't want to, and that's something we weigh back and we go back and forth and discuss. And in some cases, we realize, well, the information might be elsewhere, so we're fine letting those records go. But if we don't know and we think it's the only source, then likely is we're going to transfer it.
So we are at time, and I know a lot of folks had questions that didn't get answered. So I just want to.
I'm fine going. I mean, if people want to, I can keep talking. That's perfectly fine.
Yeah, you know what?
I figured there was going to be a lot of questions. So.
Yeah, let's do a couple more if you've got time. And there are a couple of questions kind of about the condition of records. If records are deteriorating, they're moldy, they're 100 years old, do you still need to be contacted before they're destroyed?
Yes. Case in point, actually, this morning I had somebody contact me that from a town, and that they had discovered that records had become moldy, and sent me some images, some pretty gross images. They still need to contact. Those are, in those cases there, especially if you're dealing with, when it's coming from the local unit, my advice to them is you always want to be documenting that you did your procedure. So if you're documenting, even if there is a catastrophe, there's a disaster, documenting it helps kind of save your butt, if you want to think about it that way. That they're still identifying that, hey, we had this incident, they're documenting it. My advice to them is always identify what has been damaged, especially with mold. I mean, don't, obviously, your health is more important in that case, so do it safely. But try and document what you have. So if you know you lost X, Y, and Z records from this time period to this time period, make sure you're documenting that. Talk to me, I can document it on my end, and then we can just say destroy it. Because mold is that's the worst thing you could possibly come across when you're dealing with preservation issues. And lots of times it's actually safer to destroy them because, again, even though you might be losing that information, if it's a health hazard, you don't want people accessing it. So, I mean, that's something you just want to make sure you're documenting. Other forms of deterioration, you know, if it's 100 years old, that sort of thing. Yes, I mean, they still need to talk to me. I mean, we have records going back to the formation of counties, that sort of thing. So, I mean, those old records, just because they might be kind of like the book binding might be falling apart, there's steps that you can take to repair those. So again, we always want to know before those records are destroyed, whether or not what they have, so we can kind of take action on them. And yes, condition doesn't really matter on the destruction. I think that was all the question, right?
Yeah. I think I might just do one more question before we close.
Sure.
And it's, do you offer any workshops for local officials about their obligations to public records?
Yes, we actually, over the past couple of years now, well, during the pandemic era, we did for the 2 years in the pandemic era, we did 4 virtual workshops specifically aimed at local units of government. There were all-day workshops. So basically, you get to hear the joy of me talking for 3 hours about records management and obligations and what responsibilities local units have for records care. The second part of the day was then my coworker, who's the electronic records archivist, talking about electronic records. Now, we're not doing any this year because after doing 2 years worth of those, we're kind of burnt out on it. But down the road, yes, we probably will start revisiting those again. I know there's a large number of new clerks coming in, new administrators, people, you know, the people are retiring that have been there for 30, 40 years. So you got a new group of individuals coming in and they might not know or understand. So yes, we are trying to put that information out there. But just this year, we're not offering them, but we have offered them in the past. And the other thing, that's happening now, which I'm starting to get asked to participate in, are like local associations. So like the Municipal Clerks Association, the different county associations, court associations, they're starting to meet in public again for their meetings. And when they do the workshops, and they will ask me to come and present, and I'm doing one in May for the Municipal Clerks Association and their Northern Conference, which is going to talk about basically what I just kind of outlined, but in a shorter program. So I'm going to be talking about records management and the responsibilities and how this all ties in, that sort of thing. So, yes.
Are those available online at all?
You know, let me check. I think Abby might have posted the recordings we did for the all-day workshops that we did over the past 2 years. There might be recording links on our website, but I'd have to check and see if she got those set up. The other workshops, I can't say. You'd have to ask the agencies on those. But now that you say that, we might have video recording, because we did a Zoom webinar too, so we might have it up there.
Yeah, so we'll send a follow-up email probably next week with the link to the recording to this program, and I'll include that as well if we can dig it up on our website. So I know, there are a lot of questions. I would encourage that if you have specific questions for Andrew about types of records that you have in your holdings, reach out to him directly. And yeah, just thank you so much, Andrew, for your time this morning. This has been really illuminating and helpful, I think.
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, I'm always happy to talk about this. I mean, it can be kind of dry, and kind of dense. I mean, there's a lot of information to go through, and I mean, I've been in this role for now 7 years, so it's a lot of information to cover. So yeah, it's good things to know. And if you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.